Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, so today we have somebody once again that is going to be a speaker at Gamification Europe. We'll be talking about that as well. But before we get started with all that jazz, Gianluca, are you prepared to engage?
Yes, I am.
Let's do this, because this is Professor Game, and today we have Gianluca Sgueo, who is a global media seminar professor at New York University in Florence, and a research associate at the Center of Social Studies of the University of Coimbra in Portugal. He is also department director at the Institute of Competitiveness, which is a think tank located in Rome and Brussels. His professional background includes several experiences in the public sector. In fact, from 2011 to 13, he was the head of communications of the Italian government. And since 2014, he is the Policy Analyst at the Parliamentary Research of the European Parliament. He has published very extensively on participatory democracy, lobbying, and globalization. His last book, actually, the title is Games, Powers, and Democracies, and you can find it at the Bocconi University Press. So, Gianluca, is there anything that we missed from that intro, and how bad was my pronunciation of your last name?
The pronunciation was great, so thank you. And no, you didn't miss anything. It's a lot of stuff, but I tried to merge all these activities into my weekly schedule. So thus far, I have succeeded in managing to survive. So.
You're still breathing, so that's a good sign.
Yes, exactly.
So, Gianluca, is there anything that you can tell us? Because we were talking in the pre-interview chat that you're going back and forth from Rome to Brussels. But on a regular day, except Mondays and Fridays, I think it was, on a regular day, what does your day look like? Or if you want to take two different examples, what does a day for you look like?
Yeah, exactly. That really depends on the day, on a weekly schedule. So my Mondays usually start very early at 4 o'clock in the morning, where I wake up. I live in Rome, so my family is in Rome. I have a house in Rome. I take a train, I go to Florence, and there is my class. In Florence, I teach a course on media activism and democracy. So the class is usually on Monday. Then I go back by train to Rome. Because it's more convenient to fly to Brussels via Rome. And from Monday evening to Friday morning, my schedule is pretty much the same. So I usually wake up early in the morning and I work in the Parliament as Policy Analyst. I happen to teach in the Belgian University, actually a course on gamification. Is one of the few courses on this topic. Yes, is the college is called Vesalius College. It's actually a spin-off of the VUB. VUB is the Flemish-speaking University of Belgium. As I think you know, in Belgium there are two communities. One is French-speaking, the other is Flemish-speaking. So the Flemish-speaking university is VUB, and they have this spin-off because it's entirely in English. So we have a lot of American students. And since 2017, it started as a summer course, and then it developed into a normal one semester course. I teach this gamification in politics, communications, and business. Is a pretty broad overview of gamification. Yeah,
definitely focused on your specialty as well.
Exactly. I mean, I'd like to have it more focused on the public sector innovation, which is really why I started to be interested in the topic of gamification, but I'm also trying to look at other fields, because I think for students it's important to know how gamification is applied, for example, in marketing or in politics or in the media. And yeah, nothing. And then the Friday is my flight back. This semester, I will actually make a stop in Paris because I'll be teaching on Friday afternoon at Sciences Po in Paris. just because it's on the way back to Rome. So I thought that I might have a stop, and then so Friday evening I'm in Rome, and I start back. The weekend is normally with my family, and Monday it's back again to this schedule.
That's great, Gianluca. I mean, there's no regular day, there's regular weeks. They're very strict, as it seems, and there's a lot of traveling involved, so you'll be like a million miler very, very soon, I guess.
Well, yeah, because of budgetary constraints, when I can, I use low-cost companies, and unfortunately, they don't provide anything like that. So.
No miles.
No miles, no.
Oh, but Gianluca, we have been hearing about all the fantastic things you do, all the places you teach at, and that's very, very interesting for us because there's a large portion of our audience is into education or instruction or learning in general. But we also want to know of a story of a time where, you were trying to either make an educational experience or maybe even in politics, as far as you can, of course, reveal, and things didn't go as expected. It was actually a fail or a first attempt in learning experience. Can you take us with you in that story and, of course, reveal as much as is possible for you?
Yeah, sure. I can actually bring two examples, one from my academic background and the other one from my background in the public sector. So the first one is an exercise, a simulation that we run in Bilbao, in Spain. During the summer, there is a lobbying summer academy, which is organized by a colleague called Alberto Alemanno. And the idea is to have 20-25 lobbyists or advocates from the civic sector to be trained on the most innovative topics. And my role there is to run this gamified simulation exercise. So they simulate the role of pressure groups from the civic sector and the business sector, and they have to draft a gamified advocacy plan. So they have to try to be influential, not just with the traditional lobbying strategies, but with introducing game design into their influence strategies. That was the idea. We started 2 years ago, and the first year it was well received by the participants, but at the end of the day, we really struggled to make them aware of what we mean by game design into an influence strategy. So in that sense, it was a failure for me because the idea was I'd like you to experiment a little bit with what game design means, not just in marketing, but actually in lobbying practices. But they didn't succeed. They came out with very, I would say, effective but traditional ideas. So this year, we redesigned completely the simulation, and actually the gamification part was so the value of gamification came from the simulation itself. So we did not ask them to gamify their plans, and interestingly, some of them used some game design into their strategies. So, for example, there was a group that ideated a sort of app that could gather interest from stakeholders, and this app had some game design elements. So we improved. I feel that we still have to improve, but the first failure was really useful for us. The second case
what would you say was the key learning from that first experience? What would you say is that moment, that aha moment that you said, look, this is what I got to do, and you actually went ahead, of course, and did it, and it worked?
Yeah. I think that I gave for granted that they would immediately get what game design means. So normally, as a teacher, I happen to lecture on this topic, and the first reaction is, oh, this is very interesting, this is very cool, I've never heard about it, but we can really make use of it. And so in a 1 hour lecture, I can make the public, the students, aware of what gamification is and how it can be used in, for example, in government. However, my idea in the simulation was I would like to have participants using game design And so what I learned is that 1 hour is not enough.
Huh.
No, not at all. I mean, they get the concept, but then when they have to apply their mentality, their mental structure to their job, that is the one of lobbyists, they couldn't introduce any of what we had discussed previously in class. That's why this year we decided not to push them to use game design, just to give them a lecture about what gamification is, and then have the simulation telling them, okay, this simulation is a sort of game, so you will learn how you can learn by having fun. And interesting, as I said, they tried to apply something of what I had said before in the class.
Interesting.
Well, the second one is, I would say the lesson is the same. So never assume that your audience, especially if it's an audience that is not familiar with the use of gamification, never expect them to get immediately the practicalities of gamification. And this applies to the European Parliament. There is a very interesting unit, it's called Foresight Unit. They experiment with innovations in the public sector. And last year they ran a gamified exercise where we played again the roles of different citizens, and we had to think about future scenarios that the European Union could be interested in regulating. So one, in my case, was the use of artificial intelligence in the insurance sector, which is a very interesting topic. There are a lot of ideas that are also deeply concerning, for example, about privacy or ethical reasons. And again, the idea was that we would use some innovative design, including gamification. And I would say that none of us could think about how to practically implement gamification into our strategies. And again, my feeling is that we had no time to reflect on how to transplant the theory of gamification into the practice.
And what did you like? Again, you mentioned that one of the things that you learned was the same as the previous one. It's not assuming that people already know and understand and are able, especially to apply the concepts that you're teaching there. So how do you, like, after all these experiences, what would be, or what is your new approach when doing these kinds of things?
I will actually have two different approaches. If I have just to lecture to a class of students or professionals, public civil servants, for example, as it happens quite oftenly, I just give them examples and I give them some theory about gamification. That is enough. They usually get the topic. The moment in which I'm asked to run a lab, for example, so to engage students into putting into practice the theory, what I've learned is that I need to give them much more time to reflect, and I have to make small steps. So asking them, okay, this is your goal, please gamify your strategy, never works, or they just came up with ideas that maybe are very interesting but very difficult to put into practice. So it's better to go step by step, very slowly, showing them how gamification has been used, and try to think with them on how they can introduce game design into small things.
Cool. Very interesting. And of course, after learning from these two experiences, of course, you've been getting your practice better. And we would like to hear of a quick story in which, of course, you set up to tackle a big challenge and you actually succeeded, either the first or the second or the third attempt or whatever it was. And we want to be there in that story with you. We want to understand what happened, what did you learn from it, and what would you assign that key success to? Maybe it's many things, but maybe one of the key things that you would assign it to that. Do you have such a quick story?
I have a quick story. It's in another organization where I teach. Is the business school of the Sole 24 Ore, which is a media group in Italy. They have a master on lobbying and communication, and I run into that master an influence lab. So the students have to think about a strategy to influence the European Union. And the main exercise is about drawing what we call the power map. A power map is basically a map. So it's on a paper. You locate your main stakeholders depending on their power and how likely they are to be your allies or your opponents. So if you draw the power map correctly, you have a clear idea on what kind of strategy you should apply. And what I'm trying to do is also to show them how they can use this power map to then move to the introduction of game design. And so the success story is that at the beginning, I was putting them immediately to work, asking them, okay, start and let's see what you do. And now I moved back to a more traditional approach. So first is a little bit of theory, and then is practice. I try to explain them. I know that this is a master degree. You already went to the university, so you expect to do more practical things. However, in this field, it is very important that you master the concepts before you start putting them into practice. So it's the same thing. It's what I've really learned from all these cases that I mentioned is that in the case of gamification, which is very easy to understand, it's very easy to explain from the perspective of the teacher. It's very difficult to explain when it comes about applying it. That's my main. That's what I've learned from teaching this topic.
That makes a lot of sense. And in that same line, is there any series of steps or a process that you follow when you're either teaching gamification or you're applying it to a public policy or to any project that you face? Is there, again, process steps, a framework? How do you do it?
I will say that I have a 60% theory and 40% case studies. That's my first rule. So every time for example, that's the topic on which I have some experience is the use of gamification in government. And I introduce them to behavioral sciences, which is, the umbrella concept for the use of gamification into government. And then I immediately give them an example. And then I move back to theory and then back to the example. This 60-40% is the balance that I have found and I think is effective in having the students understanding the topic, the concept. So that's my first process. A second process that I have is that when I have time, it doesn't happen all the time, but when I'm given sufficient time, I always run a very short practical session at the end. So I give them a very easy case study, and sometimes it's just in the form of a debate. So, okay, you have this issue, you are a public administration, you want to have citizens engaged into this topic. How would you do that? And so we try to move from traditional approaches to more innovative approaches, including game design.
Fantastic. That's great. Hey, engagers, this is a quick break because, as some of you might already know, Professor Game has partnered with Gamification Europe as media sponsors once again for 2019's conference in Berlin. We have also managed to secure a 10% discount for the engagers to attend to the conference. To collect your discounted tickets, all you have to do is go to professorgame.com/gamification Europe. If you do, you are not only getting a special offer, you're also supporting Professor Game through this affiliate link. As you know, Gamification Europe is a growing conference in its third edition and quite an exciting as well as a unique opportunity to get to meet top experts in gamification from all around Europe and the world. So you can get to meet many of the speakers and the people who have been interviewed in Professor Game podcast. And if you haven't already, I'd also love the chance to get to meet you in person because of course I will be there. If this also sounds engaging for you, then just click pause, go to professorgame.com/gamification Europe and get your discounted tickets. So as we've mentioned before, and especially at the start, Gianluca is going to be in Gamification Europe, and that's something that we will be talking about and that I probably just mentioned in the small break that we had. But before we get into the details of Gamification Europe, I would like to know, Gianluca, what is something that you think almost any gamification project could benefit from? Like an element, maybe a best practice, maybe a strategy, maybe something to think about. It could be completely outside the box. Is there such a thing that you would name with regards to that?
Well, that's a good question. I think my first reaction to this question will be any gamification process would really benefit from having a broad overview on what has been done in the same field by other actors in terms of failure, in terms of success, in terms of traditional approaches or more innovative approaches. My understanding of the case studies that I have studied and written about in my book is that the most successful approaches, so the best plans, were those plans where the designers had studied very carefully the best and worst practices before them.
Interesting. This is definitely a new for this podcast, but it's very, very. I mean, sometimes you might even think it's obvious, but even though it's obvious, I don't think you've faced many situations where people did it before, and that's why it is a success case for you. So that's a very, very good insight. Thank you very much for that, Gianluca. And changing the subject a bit more, who would you, after listening to these questions and understanding all the things that we've been going through, who would you say is somebody that you would like to listen to in an interview like this one in Professor Game?
I think there is a very inspirational scholar who has written one of my favorite books. His name is Dan Ariely. I hope I pronounce it correctly. He's a professor in the United States, and he wrote this amazing book called Predictably Irrational.
Yes.
You know that, yeah. Okay, so it's a big book. So and I think he's a great speaker. He's a great speaker as well. He made a very successful TED talk a few years ago, and there's plenty of videos on YouTube. And the title it tells you everything. So now it's we think. He's an economist by training, so he tells us we think that we make rational choices, so that we think about what we do in our daily lives. But actually, we are taking very irrational choices. And these irrational choices are made because we are, in a way, driven in that direction. So it's predictable, the fact that we are taking irrational choices.
In a way, it kind of breaks down what economical theory in general has been throughout many, many years, but in a way it also supports the theory. It's a very interesting approach, the one that Dan has.
Absolutely, yes. So it's a great thinker. I think he opened to me a Pandora box. If my first interest in the idea of gamification, the game design, I would say, came from reading him. And the other big, obviously, the other big scholar are actually the two scholars, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, the ideators of the idea of nudging. So that was my trigger, my motivation to look into how you can nudge people, citizens, and then I realized that one possible nudge is game design.
Absolutely. So in that same sense of recommendations, and you've mentioned already a few authors, what if you had to recommend one book to the engagers, to this audience, which book would it be and why?
So one is the one that I mentioned, Predictably Rational. It's a great book. The other one is Nudge, the one from Thaler and Sunstein, is the very first book theorizing nudge. And then, a couple of years ago, Thaler got the Nobel Prize for his theory. Very recently, actually, the book is not super recent, it's a couple of years ago, but I just had the chance to read it carefully recently this summer. It's called New Power. Is from Teams and Heymans, two scholars, again, I think from Harvard University. And it's an amazing book about how power is shifting in our world. So they explain how the vertical use of power that we used to have until a few years ago is completely changing. And so how the new power is more distributed, more transparent in a way, and I would say more democratic. It's a very inspiring book.
Fantastic. Those books sound great and very much in your field as well, Gianluca. And
yeah.
Within your field, within gamification, and probably gamification in policy or gamification in general, what would you say is your superpower within that range of gamification?
So, if I have to think about the use of gamification in the public sector, I will say that a superpower, an interesting superpower that I'd like to have more than I have, that I like to have, is how to engage citizens. You know, Rob, when I started to write the book, as you correctly mentioned, my field of expertise is democracy and participation. So I was really interested by these very innovative experiments by public administrators to actually engage citizens. Well, in the book, I happen to be a little bit more skeptical about it because I admit that gamification is still very innovative in governance, but if we look at gamification as a way to engage more citizens, to regain trust from citizens in the public sector, it has succeeded only on the short term, or it has completely failed. So if I had a superpower in gamification, that would be to engage, to make citizens having fun in being citizens.
Wow, that's very inspiring, actually. I'm going to change from such a very inspiring mood that you're having into something radically different. Well, not so radically, and because I would like to know what is your favorite game, Gianluca.
I still play this game. I started when I was 12 or 13 years old, and is Dungeons and Dragons.
RPG, wow.
Yes, but precisely that one. And we still play with the very original set of rules, which is super simple. You have only few dice and very simple rules. So we don't even go to the advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which is a little bit more complicated. And I like to play as the Dungeon Master. The Dungeon Master is pretty much the one who tells the story to the players. So I'm not playing, I'm playing, but I'm not a player into the game. I'm the one who tells the story. And
so you're like the game designer there.
Yes, exactly. I remember I spent hours in designing dungeons and words and stories. And that is the game that I still like to play.
Fantastic. And Gianluca, I've been teasing the public with with your talk in Gamification Europe. So I would like to know if you can give us, I don't know, kind of a pitch of why this is going to be interesting for us. Why maybe if somebody is still on the fences and they say, well, I would really like to listen to Gianluca in Gamification Europe, so I'm definitely going to go. What would that pitch be? How do you engage this audience that way?
I will start with a case that people are probably familiar with, and is the so-called social credit score system that is being applied in China. And for those who are not familiar with it, the social credit score system is a system in which the Chinese government is trying to give a score to the citizens depending on their behavior. And by behavior, I mean everything they do. If they spend too much time watching TV or Netflix, if they share misinformation, fake news through social media, or on the other side, if they help a member of the family, or if they drive respecting the speed limits. And the whole idea, to me, is a perfect, and I would say it's a perfect case of the use of a sort of game design into government. Citizens, like players, who are graded depending on what they do. And that is one scenario that we have ahead of us. So a government who's trying to control the citizens by introducing a system of points and rewards. And the other
and there's a huge amount of discussion on how that is good or bad gamification with the ethical side in mind, but we're not going to get into that discussion today. You're going to give another example.
Okay, another example. Well, sorry, Rob, just because I think this is interesting. I remember a student last year in the course that I teach on gamification. Obviously, one big class is the one about the Chinese system. And this student asked me, an American student, asked me something very simple. And I have to say, I couldn't answer in that very moment. He told me, yeah, okay, I get the system. I get how this could be considered unethical. But if I am a probe citizen, if I'm a citizen who just behaves as we are expected to do, why should I be worried about what the government is doing? Actually, I should be happy. And in a sense, I think this is true. Because the Chinese government is not asking citizens to kill anybody or to do something that is not ethical. Is asking citizens to behave as we are expected to behave as citizens. And that is the tricky thing behind it. So I wanted to share this with you because I think it really blew my mind, because in that moment I say, okay, I think you're right. It's just that I couldn't accept that I'm not free to take a wrong decision occasionally.
There's many places where we could get into this, but again, that's not the topic of today. I think it could be something extremely interesting to discuss when you're there in Berlin in Gamification Europe. So this is actually a teaser, and I'm containing myself from saying all my arguments here.
Exactly. That would be my main topic in the conference. So
awesome.
Hopefully there will be some discussion. Well, the other example, this is an example that I used to mention many times because I think it's very inspiring. It's Santa Monica, California, of course. One of the typical issues of a public administrator is, again, how to engage citizens into urban planning. It's very boring. It's time-consuming. People just don't care. There are the so-called usual suspects, so people that have time and will to participate, and they dominate the participation. So what they invented is an app which replicates the same system of Tinder, the dating app. So you can swipe on left or right, and basically liking or disliking the pictures that the municipality uploads about future urban planning. So citizens are re-engaged in a playful way. It has been a very successful case. A lot of young people have started to show their interest in even small changes in the city. And that, to me, is one, let's say, bright example of playful design into governance.
Wow, that's inspiring. Sounds very interesting as well. So thanks again, Gianluca. It's been awesome to have you in the podcast. Is there any final piece of advice that you would like to leave us with? Then, of course, please don't forget to leave us where we can find you in the world of the internet. And then we'll say, of course, it's game over.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me. I think I look forward to meet very inspiring people in the Gamification Lab conference. For me as a scholar, it would be a different world, so I'm really looking forward to it. And my name is online. I have a website where I share everything I write, so I'm for open knowledge. And again, thank you very much. Actually, thank you for this podcast. Usually when I shave in the morning, this is my favorite listening. So how to get inspired.
That's very kind of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So once again, thank you, Gianluca, for being with us today. However, we will see you in Berlin. But for now and for today, it's time to say that it's game over. Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. And if you want more details of this interview with Gianluca, all you have to do is type his name in professorgame.com in the search bar, and there you'll get all the details from this episode. There, you can also subscribe, and that way we can be in contact, and you will have exclusive access to opportunities that Professor Game might have for you. In fact, if you're even considering going to Gamification Europe in Berlin this December, the Engagers get special treatment. you can go directly to professorgame.com/gamification Europe and get a 10% discount. And before you press continue, do you want to know who is our special guest for episode 100? Well, you might have to wait a little bit if it's not already live, but all you have to do is subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.